Vamos a hablar de esto en los próximos minutos, de las oportunidades de lo que puede hacer un inversor en renta variable europea. Peter Moulineux, Equity Product Specialist at Alliance Bernstein. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for being with us today. The first question, we are talking about this tariffs, this Trump's tariffs. So, are European equities finally becoming attractive again?
Well, finally, that's the word. It seems like few global investors have been overweight European equities in the last few years, and that was the right call. There's US markets have vastly outperformed European ones, but we think there are finally some encouraging signs that could be changing. Firstly, if we think about valuation, we're now at such a premium, or the US is at such a premium, Europe's at such a discount of over 30%. That's way higher than it's been versus its long-term average. We're seeing that mergers and acquisitions activity is picking up, so deals are being done, and fundamentally the region is under-owned, and these encouraging signs should hopefully tip that balance. There's also some signs of a cyclical recovery. PMIs are recovering from a low base and low expectations, but moving in the right direction. What will really be positive for the region is if we could possibly see some kind of resolution in Ukraine, would act as a really great sentiment riser for those sitting outside the market looking to come in. And also we're seeing a bit of a political shift. There's more of a focus on growth and deregulation. Governments in the EU starting to return to focusing on growth, almost conscious that Europe has been somewhat left behind. But we must also remember, and this really comes back to what we believe in looking at companies fundamentally, is Europe is home to some of the great companies of the world. Fundamentals have been intact, that the companies are doing great things, but sentiment has been off, and that's what's really tipped this valuation balance. So Europe's actually started to outperform a bit this year. We've seen this as the market has broadened, not just within the US, but away from the US as well, moving away from these magnificent seven companies, the dominance of US tech. Some of the recent news has been helpful in that regard. And that's really good for active managers. We like to see a broader market where capital isn't just flowing into a small number of companies. And if we think of earnings seasons, it's particularly important this time in a very volatile conditions. It's early days, but we are seeing some companies come in with earnings about 2% above consensus. When we look at the European market, it's quite concentrated. There's some big themes. Think of luxury goods. We saw from Richemont that some good results, but quite different across its brands. So quite good in terms of jewelry being the standout, but somewhat weaker in wines and spirits. But what a company like that is able to do is where it's growing well, is it can reinvest those profits into the brand, into the product to fuel further growth. In semis, we've got ASML as a huge company in the index. That's actually posted some quite good results along with Infineon as well. On the less good side, on profit warnings, it does seem to be more idiosyncratic in nature. So it's company by company rather than these big top-down themes of certain industries or sectors doing better or worse than others. Another big theme, excuse the pun, is the obesity drugs. We see that from Novo Nordisk. Really quite a volatile time for Novo Nordisk. We had some slightly weaker results from CagriSema, one of their drugs before Christmas. Slightly more positive from amycretin after Christmas. And then we're waiting for some new trials to come out and really see how patients have been reacting to increasing doses and whether there'll be any side effects on those. That's really going to drive how the market reacts to that opportunity there. So we think, just to conclude, there are some reasons to be optimistic at the company level and improving sentiment. We hope that valuation gap will close.
And Peter, we are also speaking about Trump's tariffs and what challenges are European companies facing from the policy direction.
Yeah, well, it's clear that with
Trump administration,
Donald Trump in the White House, we're not going to be short of news flow or volatility, and we've seen that this week, particularly with the news flowing really quickly, changing really quickly. It's clear that ultimately our new US president is a deal maker. He puts America first, but he's also pro-growth, pro the economy. But he's launched a lot of policies that could make life difficult for European companies. But really, you've got to think of the consumer. These tariffs are a tax on the price of goods. So it's the consuming companies and the consumers, you or I, buying the products that will ultimately pay these excess tariffs. So what that will mean for European companies is that potentially they could be less competitive versus some of their US peers. But we also have to remind ourselves that a lot of these outcomes might be less severe than the so-called threat that's in the news at the moment. So the key is to monitor the impact of these tariffs on inflation and therefore rate cuts and growth. So there's a real macro effect that these tariffs could have going on. But also, just to think that some of this will be a bargaining tactic rather than actual policy. And we can look back in time and we can see what happened in 2018, the last round of trade wars or tariff wars, however you want to describe it. And if you look at those, contrary to what people expected, inflation actually fell somewhat. It helped by a strong dollar. That should again help. It didn't really have a discernible impact on growth. So what it really means is look at some of the companies, some of those weaker companies with harder positions versus their competitors. They're going to be unable to absorb tariffs or create inefficiencies or pass on costs to their consumers. So we need to look at individual companies, and we suggest focusing on companies with good pricing power that are able to pass on those costs or make efficiencies and save them within their business models. That means being taking a capital light approach of running their business. And it's also really important to consider supply chains.
And Peter, I think it's important to think on that at this moment. Which European companies may even benefit from the US tariffs, particularly in the industrial sector?
Yeah. So it's about strong pricing power and a local for local operations. We can talk about those later, but thinking about supply chains, what we've seen in the last 5 years is quite a lot of companies had to re-optimize their supply chains anyway. During the pandemic, they were unable to move goods around as efficiently as they had to in this really globalization phase we had before that. So as companies de-globalized their supply chains and onshored a lot of activities or sought out new places to do business, that really transforms the way they were looking at their supply chain. So they'll be able to take some of that knowledge and use that now. But particularly, we're looking for high quality businesses with strong players in industries which will be easier to optimize their supply chains. I think a great example is a company like Adidas. It's shifted a lot of its sourcing away from China to reduce this risk. And the key there is that it's a really trusted brand. When we think of a trusted brand, it's easy to think that, well, as a trusted brand, customers will pay more for that product. But of course, in sportswear apparel, it's highly competitive globally. You can't just pass on those increased costs to your customers. You'll lose out versus more established competitors who don't have to have the tariffs. So what Adidas can do with its trusted brand is use its business opportunity, its global reach, its brand to negotiate much quicker deals with other countries where it can move its supply chains out of China. And it's actually been able to do that within Asia, forging new relationships quite well. So that's given them some advantage over its less respected rivals and should help it to be more immunized from trade tariffs.
Conversation. What should investors in European equities to do to find resilient companies during this period of political change from abroad?
Well, I think it's it comes down to business models. We're looking particularly at some of the industrials companies, what they're doing. There's a few examples of how these European countries operate globally. You think about Diploma, it's a UK diversified industrial company. It operates in controls, seals, and life sciences, so super diversified. And they operate under a business model of making a series of acquisitions, really effective acquisitions. And now over half of its revenues are actually sourced from the US, and 75% of its inputs to those businesses are locally sourced as well. And because their actual operations are local in the US, they shouldn't be hit by these tariffs, whereas their rivals based in China will be. Sticking to the theme, BioRef is a Swedish industrial manufacturer of heating and cooling systems. It's enjoying huge growth in the US, where its business, again, it has local suppliers, so tariffs are not a threat. The theme there is that in industrials, your suppliers are supplying you with relatively uncomplicated parts. So it's easier to find suppliers locally who can give you the equipment you need without having to build a really complicated network of dedicated specialists, which you would see in something like the tech sector. So it really comes down to having a clear objective of the types of companies you want to own, building conviction in the management teams who are running those companies, and that they can execute on an effective corporate strategy. Look at the pricing power, look at local for local, where are these companies sourcing their opportunities from? And just stay disciplined, looking for these durable business models. Ultimately, companies that have dominant positions in niche markets will be able to withstand the degree of tariffs. So if investors can find companies like this, then they should be well placed for uncertain times ahead.
Peter Moulineux, equity product specialist at Alliance Bernstein. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good afternoon.
Bye.